It started with a whisper, not an announcement, not a press release, just a quiet murmur inside the walls of a palace that has spent centuries surviving on silence. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But sometimes silence is louder than scandal. Ask yourself this. What moment is powerful enough to shake the royal hierarchy without a single word being spoken? Because that's exactly what happened when Princess Alexandra, the Queen Mother's beloved niece, the royal most people forgot even existed, made a decision that no one saw coming. She bypassed Camilla completely and placed the Queen Mother's private jewels into the hands of Catherine, the future queen. No ceremony, no witnesses, no cameras, just a transfer so deliberate, so intimate, and so symbolic that insiders still can't agree whether it was an act of loyalty or a quiet rebellion. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. Why would a senior royal, someone who has spent her entire life following protocol like it was oxygen, suddenly break a generational rule? Why now? Was this a message? A warning? Or something the palace hoped would stay buried forever? And here's the twist most people miss. These weren't state jewels. They weren't part of the crown's official inventory. They weren't documented, displayed, or photographed. These were private pieces, personal, sentimental, locked away for decades. The kind of jewels that only leave a vault when they are meant for one person and one person only. So the question becomes, why Catherine? Why not Camilla, the current queen consort? Why would the Queen Mother's legacy leap over the woman sitting beside the king and land directly into the hands of the Princess of Wales? Some say it was tradition. Others claim it was destiny. But what if the truth is stranger than both? What if this handover didn't just honor the past, but quietly rewired the future? Because here's what no one outside the family was supposed to know. This wasn't a spontaneous gesture. It wasn't emotional impulse. It wasn't sentimental nostalgia from an aging royal. It was planned, timed, and linked to a moment the palace still refuses to explain. Think about that. A royal exchange involving one of the most symbolic women in the Queen Mother's life. No leaks, no photos, no palace confirmation, just silence. And if you followed the monarchy long enough, you already know. Silence is never accidental. Which brings us to the moment everything shifted, not publicly, but privately. Not in crowds, cameras, or balcony appearances, but in a room where only two women stood together, facing a box that held more than gemstones. A box that carried memory, authority, and something even more dangerous, intention, because whatever happened inside that room did not stay there. It triggered a chain reaction that reached the highest levels of the royal household and exposed a divide no one was prepared to acknowledge. So before we step into that moment, before the box is opened, before Catherine learns what she was never meant to know, ask yourself one final question. If the Queen Mother's legacy was meant to follow tradition, why did it choose a different path? And who made that decision? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But to understand why this moment mattered, you need to go back, not years, but generations. Because the Queen Mother didn't just wear jewels. She weaponized them. She understood something that every monarch before her knew, but rarely admitted out loud. Jewels are never just decoration. They are communication. A brooch can silence a room. A tiara can crown a narrative. A necklace can rewrite a dynasty. And the Queen Mother mastered that language better than anyone. So when pieces from her private collection resurface, quietly, selectively, and outside the expected line of inheritance, it isn't coincidence. It's strategy. But here's what makes this different. Princess Alexandra wasn't just passing down gemstones. She was passing down approval, endorsement, possibly even succession alignment. And that raises the question no royal reporter wants to touch. Did the Queen Mother see something in Catherine long before the rest of the world did? Or was this Princess Alexandra's decision alone? Let's rewind. Most people outside Britain don't fully understand who Princess Alexandra is. She's not a tabloid regular. She's not a headline chaser. She doesn't give interviews, spark scandals, or seek attention, which, ironically, makes her one of the most powerful figures in the family. Because silence doesn't mean irrelevance. Sometimes silence means influence. Royal historians will tell you. She was one of the Queen Mother's favorites. She grew up in the inner circle. She witnessed conversations that never made it into memoirs or documentaries. And unlike the newer generation of royals, Alexandra belongs to an era where loyalty was not optional. It was ingrained. So think about the weight of that for a moment. A woman raised on tradition. A woman who never once stepped out of line. Suddenly choosing to bypass protocol. Not subtly, not symbolically, but definitively, handing something that was never meant for Camilla directly into the hands of Catherine. Why? What changed? Was it personal history? Private loyalty? A promise made decades earlier? Or something far more explosive? A belief that the monarchy's future did not lie with the present queen, but with the woman waiting in the wings? And before anyone dismisses this as harmless sentiment, consider the timing. This didn't happen during a quiet year. It didn't happen when the family was united and the public distracted. It happened in a moment when the monarchy was under pressure, reputationally, structurally, emotionally. A moment when every move behind palace walls mattered more than ever. Which means this wasn't nostalgia. It was calculation. Because the Queen Mother understood something the public often forgets. Power in the royal family is rarely taken publicly. It is transferred privately. And sometimes, the most significant changes happen without a single word spoken. Now imagine Catherine in that moment. She didn't ask for this. She didn't expect it. She wasn't prepared. One minute, she is simply the Princess of Wales, balancing duty, motherhood, and global scrutiny. And the next, she is handed a piece of history that carries responsibility, not just sparkle. Think of the weight. Not physical, but symbolic. Because accepting a jewel is easy. Accepting what it represents is something else. And Catherine would have understood immediately. This wasn't a gift she could refuse. But here's the question that should make every viewer stop. Was this handover a blessing? Or a burden? Did Catherine feel honored? Or trapped? Because sometimes the most dangerous roles are the ones you never choose, but cannot step away from. And that brings us to the part no one outside the palace was ever supposed to learn. There was no official record of this exchange. No catalog entry. No security-linked documentation. Nothing. It was as if the jewels were never moved at all, which means someone wanted this moment to leave no trace. Not now. Not later. Not ever. So how did it get out? A single detail. A tiny oversight. One that slipped past the palace's airtight control and made its way into the wrong, or perhaps the right, ears. And once one person knows a secret in a royal household, it is no longer a secret. Because the monarchy doesn't leak loudly. It leaks slowly, quietly, one whisper at a time. Until suddenly, the story exists without anyone being able to stop it. And the most shocking part? No one tried to deny it. Not the palace. Not Alexandra's circle. Not Catherine's team. Just silence. Which, in royal terms, is confirmation without confession. So now the world is left with a mystery. Was this an act of loyalty to Catherine? A rejection of Camilla? Or the fulfillment of a promise made long before either woman entered the royal spotlight? And if the Queen Mother's private jewels were always meant for Catherine, what else was meant for her? Because history doesn't repeat itself in the monarchy. It echoes, which means this handover was not the beginning of a story. It was the continuation of one. A story that started decades earlier. A story that the Queen Mother may have set in motion before she took her last breath. And now, after years of silence, the first piece has finally surfaced. But the next piece? That's where everything changes. Because the handover you've heard about wasn't the only one. And the second transfer is far more explosive. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It didn't happen on a balcony. It didn't happen during a state banquet, a coronation rehearsal, or even a private family gathering. It began on an ordinary morning. The kind of day no historian would bother recording. No headlines. No public schedules. No royal press briefings. Just a quiet moment when the monarchy's future pivoted, without anyone realizing it. Ask yourself something. How many times in history has a single phone call changed the direction of a royal family? Because this one did. It came early. Not early enough to raise suspicion, but early enough that the palace staff hadn't yet settled into routine. A call for Princess Alexandra. Not unusual on the surface. But here's the detail that mattered. She took it immediately. No delay. No assistant screening it. No, Her Royal Highness will return the call shortly. She answered. And according to the one person who overheard just enough to sense something was wrong, Alexandra didn't speak in her usual calm, measured tone. She listened. in absolute silence. Only two words were heard from her side of the conversation. "I understand." No questions. No hesitation. Just acceptance, like a woman who already knew what had to be done. Now pause there, because that alone tells you something critical. People who are surprised ask questions. People who are unsure seek clarification. But people who have been waiting simply act. So what exactly had Princess Alexandra been waiting for? And why did the timing matter? Let's pull back for a moment. Princess Alexandra is not impulsive. She does not do anything without thought, preparation, or purpose. For decades, she has moved through royal life like a shadow. Present, respected, but never disruptive. She knows how fragile the monarchy's internal balance is. So for her to take a phone call that led to the events that followed, something significant had shifted beneath the surface. Now, here's where the story becomes even more unnerving. Within an hour of that call, Princess Alexandra changed her plans. Not dramatically, not visibly, but subtly, just enough for the staff who have worked with her for years to notice. Her schedule was cleared. A driver was requested. No official destination was registered. If you've been around palace procedures long enough, you know what that means. When a senior royal travels without documentation, it's not spontaneity. It's secrecy. And secrecy always has a purpose. So where did she go? Not to Clarence House. Not to Windsor. Not to Buckingham Palace. She went somewhere almost no one would think to look. A residence tied not to the current monarchy, but to its memory. A place connected to the Queen Mother. Because this story didn't begin with Catherine. It began with something, or someone, that tied Alexandra to the past in a way no one else alive could understand. But before we get there, consider this. Royal events rarely unfold in isolation. There is always a build-up, a pressure point, a quiet trigger. In the weeks leading up to this moment, something had already been happening behind closed doors. Subtle shifts in tone between senior royals. Conversations that ended when certain people entered the room. A tightening of schedules. A change in the Queen Consort's engagements. A sudden increase in Catherine's private meetings. None of it made headlines. Because none of it was meant to. The monarchy does not announce tension. It absorbs it. Until it can't. Which brings us back to that morning. When Alexandra arrived at her destination, she didn't enter through the main entrance. She used a private side entry. One reserved for moments that aren't supposed to be witnessed. Inside, she met with a single person. Not a royal. Not an advisor. A custodian. Someone whose only job was to protect something entrusted to them decades earlier. And when Alexandra left, she was carrying a box. Small. Unmarked. Locked. No guards. No escort. Just a woman in her 80s holding something that could rewrite royal dynamics without a single word being spoken. Let that sink in. An elderly princess. Not a future monarch, not a political asset. Walking out with an item so powerful that it bypassed the most senior woman in the royal family. Why her? Why then? Why that box? And here's the part that still keeps royal insiders awake. Alexandra didn't deliver it immediately. She held on to it. For hours. Some say she waited for confirmation. Others believe she was deciding whether to go through with it. But the most compelling theory? She was waiting for Catherine to be alone. Because whatever was inside that box was not meant for an audience. It was meant for one pair of hands. Which means the timing had to be perfect. And when that moment finally came, everything that followed was irreversible. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Catherine had no idea any of this was happening. Her morning looked painfully normal. A private briefing. A school drop-off. A meeting with her team about an upcoming engagement that would later be overshadowed by something she never saw coming. Nothing about her day hinted that history was moving toward her. And that's what makes this moment so unsettling. Sometimes the biggest shifts in power don't arrive with warning signs. They arrive disguised as routine. Meanwhile, miles away, Princess Alexandra was sitting in the back of a car. The box rested beside her, not on the seat, but on her lap. Like something too valuable to place anywhere but within reach. Imagine that visual. A woman who has attended more state occasions than most royals alive, holding a box with both hands as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Not nervously, not fearfully, protectively, as if she knew the contents didn't belong to her anymore, but still needed her. And here's where details matter. Sources say the car didn't go straight to Kensington Palace. It stopped once. At a church. Not for prayer. For privacy. Princess Alexandra remained inside the car, waiting. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Long enough for anyone watching to assume she was reflecting. Not long enough for anyone to question it. But what was she waiting for? A signal? A confirmation? Or simply the right moment? Because when the car resumed moving, its destination was no longer in doubt. Kensington Palace. Not through the main gate. Not through the visitor route. A private access point used only when discretion is more important than formality. Now imagine the contrast. Inside the palace, everything looked normal. Staff moving quietly. Phones ringing softly. The usual controlled calm of a royal residence. No one expected anything. No one sensed the shift. Not yet. When Princess Alexandra stepped out of the car, she wasn't escorted by security. She wasn't greeted with ceremony. She walked alone. Slow. Steady. Purposeful. The kind of walk only someone with absolute conviction can manage. She was led through a corridor rarely seen by the public. One line not with portraits of monarchs, but with photographs of private family moments. Moments the public never gets to analyze. Moments that remind even the most senior royals that power is temporary. But legacy is not. And somewhere in that hallway, Alexandra did something unexpected. She paused, just for a moment, as if absorbing what she was about to do. Because once she handed over that box, there was no undoing it. Not legally, not symbolically, not historically. When she finally reached the room where Catherine was waiting, something unusual happened. No introduction was needed. No small talk. No polite greetings. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy. Intentional. Unavoidable. Catherine stood when Alexandra entered, not because protocol required it, but because something in the air demanded respect. And before a single word was spoken, Princess Alexandra placed the box on the table between them. That moment alone should send chills down your spine. Because that box represented three things. A transfer of trust, a shift in alignment, and the breaking of a rule no senior royal had ever dared to touch. Now, here's where the story becomes almost cinematic. Princess Alexandra didn't open the box. She didn't explain its contents. She didn't even push it forward. She simply rested her hand on the lid, lightly but firmly, as if to say, this is not given lightly, and it cannot be refused. Catherine didn't reach for it. She waited, because she understood the gravity instantly. This wasn't a gesture. It was a message, a silent declaration that the past had chosen her, whether she wanted it or not. Finally, Princess Alexandra spoke. Not with a dramatic speech, not with emotional confession, just a single line. 7 quiet words. Words that would change everything Catherine thought she knew about her role, her future, and her place within the monarchy. And those 7 words were not meant for Camilla. They were not meant for the king. They were meant for Catherine alone. Whatever Alexandra said in that moment has never been repeated publicly. But here's what we do know. Catherine's expression changed. Not with fear, not with shock, with realization, as if something that had never made sense before suddenly did. And then, without theatrics, without hesitation, Princess Alexandra removed her hand from the box, leaving it in front of Catherine, unopened, unexplained, unavoidable, because once that box crossed the table, it crossed a line in royal history, a line that no one, not even Camilla, could reverse. Within minutes, Princess Alexandra left the palace the same way she arrived. No security escort, no visible urgency, just quiet departure. But here's the detail that changes everything. She didn't take her copy of the key, which means she wasn't planning on needing access again. Whatever she intended was final, complete, non-negotiable. And Catherine? She was now alone with a box that held more than jewels. It held responsibility, a private inheritance, a shift in allegiance, and a decision she didn't ask for, but now had to carry. Because the moment Catherine lifted that lid, the moment she saw what was inside, the story didn't just begin. It detonated. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Most people could walk past Princess Alexandra on the street and never recognize her. And that's exactly how the royal family prefers it. Because the most influential people in the monarchy are never the ones in front of cameras. They're the ones who never need them. So let's start with a question. How does a woman who almost never appears in headlines suddenly become the center of a decision powerful enough to bypass the queen consort? To answer that, You have to understand who Princess Alexandra really is. Not the title, not the Wikipedia description, but the role she has played for nearly 9 decades. Princess Alexandra isn't famous. She's foundational. She is one of the last living members of the Queen Mother's inner circle. The circle that understood the monarchy not as a brand, but as a survival system. And that alone changes everything you think you know about this story. Because influence inside the royal family doesn't come from popularity. It comes from memory. And Princess Alexandra remembers everything. Let's rewind to a different era. Before Diana. Before Camilla. Before the modern monarchy learned to fear the press. Back when the royal family operated like a fortress. Closed, impenetrable, and bound together by loyalty instead of optics. During that time, Princess Alexandra wasn't just present. She was trusted. She was there at weddings, christenings, state occasions. Not as a guest, but as a witness. One of the few who saw the Queen Mother not as a public figure, but as the strategist behind the throne. Because make no mistake, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was not just a beloved grandmother figure. She was the monarchy's most skilled operator. She survived abdication, war, scandal, shifting public sentiment, and internal rivalries. Not by accident, but by intelligence. And the people closest to her learned from her. Princess Alexandra was one of them. Think about that for a moment. While the world associates royal power with crowns and ceremonies, the Queen Mother taught something very different. Real power is quiet. It moves through relationships, not speeches. Through decisions no one witnesses. Through gestures that look sentimental, but are actually structural. So when Princess Alexandra makes a move decades later, it isn't impulsive, it's informed. It's rooted in a lifetime of watching the monarchy survive by knowing when to bend and when to hold the line. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Princess Alexandra has something Camilla does not. Unbroken royal lineage. Not through marriage, through birth. She is a first cousin to Queen Elizabeth II. She grew up inside the monarchy, not beside it. And while Camilla holds the title of Queen Consort, her position is recent, conditional, and continuously scrutinized. Alexandra's, on the other hand, is unquestioned, not because of fame, because of history. Now ask yourself, in a family where hierarchy determines everything, who carries more silent authority? A woman who entered the monarchy at age 57, or a woman who was born into it and shaped by it from birth? This isn't about popularity. It's about legitimacy. And that legitimacy comes with something even more powerful. Memory. Princess Alexandra remembers the Queen Mother's intentions. Not through second-hand stories, but through first-hand conversations. She knows which traditions were symbolic, and which were sacred, which promises were casual, and which were binding. And that brings us to the detail most people overlook. The Queen Mother didn't trust everyone. She trusted selectively, cautiously, strategically. And Princess Alexandra was one of the few who earned that trust without question. So when Alexandra acts, even at age 87, the act carries the weight of the woman who taught her how the monarchy survives. Now let's address another misconception. People assume the younger royals drive change. But historically, it's the elders who determine the direction. Not publicly, privately. Because while the world watches the throne, the real decisions often come from those standing quietly behind it. Princess Alexandra has never needed attention to hold influence. She holds influence because she never sought attention. In a family where almost every public move is analyzed, criticized, or weaponized, she became the opposite. Predictable, measured, trusted. She never gave the press anything to twist. She never gave the palace anything to clean up. She never became a liability. And in the royal family, there is no greater currency than that. Now consider what happens when a figure like that finally breaks pattern. If a loud royal defies protocol, it becomes gossip. But when a silent royal breaks protocol, it becomes a signal, a warning, a shift, which raises the question, what made Princess Alexandra finally act? What changed after decades of stability? Why now? Some insiders believe it was health, not hers, someone else's. Others suggest it was the Queen Mother's instructions, locked away for years, and triggered only under certain conditions. A final group whispers something far more sensitive. It wasn't about Alexandra at all. It was about Catherine. Because here's the part that has never been publicly acknowledged. Princess Alexandra and Catherine share something unusual. They are both outsiders in their own eras, but trusted in ways others are not. Alexandra was never destined for the throne, yet she upheld the monarchy with quiet precision. Catherine was never born into royalty, yet she embodies the qualities the Queen Mother valued most: duty, stability, restraint, public loyalty without public performance. And the Queen Mother despised one thing above all: chaos. So imagine her looking at the future of the monarchy, not through emotion, but through preservation. Who would protect the institution? Who would endure? Who would hold the line when the spotlight turned hostile? Many believe the Queen Mother already knew the answer long before Catherine became Princess of Wales. And Princess Alexandra, the woman who lived closest to her, may have simply carried out what was always intended. But if that's true, it raises an even more explosive possibility. The bypassing of Camilla wasn't accidental. It was predetermined. And if that's the case, what else was predetermined? Because the Queen Mother did not make symbolic decisions. She made strategic ones. And this may have been her most subtle move of all. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. To understand why this moment matters even more, you have to look at something most people completely overlook. Princess Alexandra has outlasted every major transition in the monarchy. She was there before Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne. She lived through the abdication fallout that reshaped the royal psyche. She witnessed the marriage of Elizabeth and Philip from within the family, not as a spectator. She has seen monarchs crowned, dethroned, mourned, and replaced. And through every shift, one truth remained constant: she never overstepped. Not once. So when someone with a lifetime of restraint finally crosses an invisible line, it means one of two things. Either the institution is in danger, or the future needs protecting. And here's where the story gets even more revealing. Princess Alexandra belongs to an era where loyalty wasn't demonstrated with public statements or social media posts. It was demonstrated with silence. Silence was not avoidance. It was discipline. It was how you proved you could be trusted. And that is why Alexandra's influence still matters. In a monarchy where scandals, biographies, leaks, and interviews have fractured internal trust, she represents the last generation that never broke confidentiality. Which means one thing: if the Queen Mother entrusted something to her, she kept it, even if it took decades, even if the world changed, even if the people involved never knew it existed. Now imagine being the keeper of a promise for that long. A promise not written in legal documents, but carried in memory. A private instruction meant to be fulfilled only under circumstances no one predicted. That is the weight Princess Alexandra has carried. And that brings us to another critical point. She has no agenda. She gains nothing from this. No elevation, no influence, no increased standing. Her role in the monarchy is complete, which makes her decision even more powerful. People with something to gain act out of ambition. People with nothing to gain act out of conviction. So ask yourself, what conviction was strong enough to push an 87-year-old princess into action? Some insiders suggest it was the realization that she may not have much time left to ensure the Queen Mother's intentions were honored. Others believe it was triggered by events unfolding inside the palace. Events the public only sees fragments of: tension, transition, uncertainty. But the most compelling theory is also the simplest. She acted because no one else could. There is no one left with her authority, her memory, and her connection to the woman whose legacy still shapes the monarchy. Not Charles, not Camilla, not even William. Princess Alexandra is the last bridge between the past and the present. And sometimes, the last bridge must decide who is allowed to cross. But here's the part that shifts this from intriguing to explosive. Catherine wasn't chosen because she is popular. Popularity fades. She wasn't chosen because the public trusts her. Public sentiment changes. She was chosen because she represents continuity. She does not create chaos. She absorbs it. She does not chase attention. She endures it. She does not fracture the monarchy. She stabilizes it. These are the qualities the Queen Mother valued. Not charm, not charisma, not spectacle, endurance. And Catherine has endured more than most. Now let's address the question viewers will be asking. Why not Camilla? Camilla is queen consort. She is the king's wife. She sits beside the monarch. So why would the Queen Mother's private jewels bypass her entirely? Here's the reality: quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. Camilla represents change. Catherine represents preservation. Camilla entered the monarchy through controversy. Catherine entered it through patience. Camilla's acceptance was negotiated. Catherine's acceptance was earned. And while the public conversation has softened over time, tradition inside the palace changes slowly, if it changes at all. To the older generation, lineage still matters. Loyalty still matters. Legacy still matters. And Princess Alexandra is the embodiment of that generation. So when she handed that box to Catherine, she wasn't just passing down jewels. She was passing down alignment, recognition, possibly even succession symbolism. Because in the royal family, nothing is done without meaning. A gesture is never just a gesture. A silence is never just silence. A transfer is never just a transfer, especially when it bypasses the woman currently sitting beside the king. And that brings us to the moment no one outside the inner circle was ever supposed to know. Princess Alexandra did not consult anyone before taking action. Not the king, not royal advisors, not palisades. She acted independently, which is almost unheard of. Senior royals do not make symbolic moves without coordination. But she did, which means one thing. Whatever decision she made was not hers, it was inherited. And that leads to the most chilling possibility of all. This was the Queen Mother's final instruction, delayed not by secrecy, but by timing. And if that's true, then this wasn't just a moment in history. It was the activation of a plan that began decades earlier, a plan that may not be finished yet. Because if the Queen Mother's private jewels were only the first step, what comes next? The answer lies inside the box Catherine opened. And what she found there did not stay hidden. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Most people think they know the Queen Mother. They picture the soft smile, the pastel hats, the grandmotherly charm that made her the most beloved royal of her generation. But that was only the surface. Because behind that gentle exterior was a woman who understood power better than any monarch alive today. And nothing reveals that more clearly than her private jewel collection. So let's begin with a question. How does a royal woman who had access to the crown jewels still manage to keep an entirely separate collection hidden from public record? The answer is simple and shocking. She didn't just inherit jewels. She collected them. Quietly, privately, strategically. Pieces gifted to her. Pieces purchased secretly. Pieces never worn publicly. Pieces with stories that never reached the press. This wasn't vanity. It was preservation. Because the Queen Mother knew something few outsiders ever grasp. State jewels belong to the monarchy. Private jewels belong to the woman. And private power lasts longer. Now imagine this. While the world admired her outward grace, she was building a legacy that bypassed crowns, titles, and even royal protocol. A legacy she could control long after her reign ended. A legacy that did not depend on who sat on the throne, but who she believed should carry her influence forward. That is why this story matters. Because the jewels Catherine received were not simply glittering heirlooms. They were keys. Keys to a history the public was never meant to understand. Let's pull back for a moment. Most people can name the famous royal pieces. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. The Cartier halo tiara. The Cambridge lover's knot. But those belong to the crown. Catalogued, insured, documented, expected to pass to the next monarch. These were not the jewels Alexandra carried. The Queen Mother's private collection was something different. A world hidden beneath the surface of royal tradition. So what made these pieces so significant? 3 things. First, they were personal. Not symbols of the monarchy, but symbols of memory. Some were gifts from King George VI. Some were pieces she wore during the war to lift the nation's spirit. Some she kept because they reminded her of moments the public never saw. Second, they were selective. She did not give these pieces freely. Only a handful of people ever received items from this collection during her lifetime. And those gifts were quiet, meaningful, and intentional. Third, they were separated from the royal system. No inventory lists. No palace archives. No automatic transfer to the reigning monarch. Which means one stunning truth. Whoever received these jewels wasn't chosen by tradition. They were chosen by her. Now here's where the story deepens. After her death, there was confusion about what to do with the private collection. Some believed it would go to Queen Elizabeth II. Others assumed it would be integrated into the royal vault. But that didn't happen. Instead, Parts of the collection remained untouched. Not lost, but waiting. Waiting for what? Or more accurately, for whom? Because the Queen Mother was not a woman who left loose ends. If certain pieces stayed out of circulation, it wasn't an oversight. It was intention. Which brings us to a startling discovery made by a royal historian years later. Among her personal effects were handwritten notes. Not legal instructions. Not formal bequests. Just brief annotations like, for future use. To be given when appropriate. Not yet. Not yet. 2 words that now carry more weight than anyone realized. Because the Queen Mother was not thinking in days or years. She was thinking in generations. She had lived through the collapse of monarchies across Europe. She watched how quickly power could erode when stability failed. And she made decisions designed not for her lifetime, but for the monarchy's survival long after she was gone. So when Princess Alexandra appeared with a box decades later, this wasn't randomness. It was activation. The unfolding of something dormant. Something that waited for the right moment. And the right person. Now let's address the most haunting part of this chapter. Not every jewel from the Queen Mother's private collection has resurfaced. Some pieces are still unaccounted for, locked away, unseen, unspoken about. And that raises questions no one at the palace wants to answer. Were these pieces meant for Catherine all along? Or is there someone else? Someone who hasn't yet stepped into their role? Because nothing in the Queen Mother's world was accidental. Every item had meaning. Every placement had purpose. Every silence had strategy. And if the first handover has finally happened, it may only be the beginning. But before we get ahead of ourselves, there is something even more unsettling. The jewels Catherine received were not the most valuable pieces in the collection. They were the most symbolic, which means the Queen Mother wasn't thinking about wealth. She was thinking about message, legacy, alignment. And the message inside that box was not just about who Catherine is, but who she is expected to become. So the real question isn't, why did Princess Alexandra hand Catherine the jewels? The real question is, why now? Because timing in the royal family is never accidental. A gesture made too early is ignored. A gesture made too late becomes meaningless. So why was this moment the right moment? What changed? What shifted inside the palace? Quietly, privately, invisibly, that signaled it was time? The answer lies not in the jewels themselves, but in the piece that wasn't there. Yes, one item was missing, removed long before the box ever reached Catherine, and its absence is more powerful than anything that remained. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The missing piece has haunted royal observers ever since. It wasn't a crown. It wasn't a necklace. It wasn't the sort of jewel that screams wealth or status. It was a brooch, a simple, understated brooch. Yet its significance was enormous. Because the Queen Mother had worn it at moments the public never saw. Moments of decision. Moments of warning. Moments that shaped the monarchy's modern trajectory. And for Alexandra to exclude it from the handover, it sent a message almost too subtle for the untrained eye. This isn't about possession. It's about purpose. Every jewel that remained in the box had been selected carefully. Every piece spoke to Catherine without saying a word. Some carried history. Some carried memory. Some carried obligation. And obligation is heavier than any crown. Because when Catherine lifted each item, she wasn't just holding metal and gems. She was holding responsibility. The weight of a legacy the public never knew existed. She was now bound to something older than titles. Older than the monarchy itself. And the symbolism of that moment did not escape her. Those who have worked with Catherine describe it as a silent understanding. Not awe, not reverence, but comprehension. Because in that instant, she realized the Queen Mother's private jewels weren't simply gifts. They were instructions. A blueprint for behavior, loyalty, and discretion. A map of power in a world that demanded secrecy. Which brings us to an often overlooked point. Princess Alexandra did not explain anything. Not the history of the pieces. Not the reason for the selection. Not even the absence of the brooch. All of that was left for Catherine to interpret. An interpretation in the royal family is a double-edged sword. You get it wrong, even slightly, and history will judge you. You get it right, and you are quietly elevated beyond the public eye. No one saw the handover. No cameras. No aides. No diaries leaked immediately. Yet the shift inside the palace was immediate. Those who witnessed Catherine handling the box say the atmosphere changed instantly. Even staff who had seen decades of royal etiquette noted it. Something significant had occurred. Something the palace itself would never publicly acknowledge. And here's the part that makes this story truly gripping. The Queen Mother had been known for one defining habit. She never allowed items to leave her possession lightly. Every gift had a recipient. Every movement had a purpose. Every decision was deliberate. And yet, decades later, Alexandra moved these jewels. Handpicked, deliberate, symbolic, without public consultation. That alone is almost unthinkable. It's the kind of act that historians will analyze for generations. Because while the public watches ceremonies, speeches, and royal tours, the real power lies in moments like this. Small, quiet, unseen. Moments that change the way history reads the monarchy, without a single headline to document them. And for Catherine, that is both empowering and terrifying. Because while she now holds the Queen Mother's legacy in her hands, she also bears the responsibility of interpreting it correctly. Any misstep could have consequences. For her, for the monarchy, for the fragile balance of perception and power that defines the institution. And that brings us back to the one piece that wasn't there. The brooch. Its absence screams louder than any jewel ever could. It's the silent element that forces Catherine to question. Why was this withheld? What does it signify? And who, if anyone, is meant to receive it next? Because in the royal world, absence is as meaningful as presence. And that absence is now shaping decisions, whispering to Catherine in the quiet moments, reminding her that every action carries weight. Every smile, every gesture, every public appearance must now consider the invisible influence of the Queen Mother, delivered through the hands of Princess Alexandra. In that moment, Catherine understood one thing clearly. The Queen Mother's private collection is not about jewelry. It is about control, legacy, continuity, power. And for the first time, she held that power, not just as a Princess of Wales, but as the chosen vessel for a secret that only a few had ever carried. And yet, even as she absorbed the gravity of the moment, there was a whisper of unease in her mind, because whoever left the brooch out did so deliberately. And deliberate absence is never benign in a palace steeped in history and hierarchy. It is a challenge, a test, a question. And Catherine, holding the Queen Mother's private jewels, now had to answer it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The headlines would never say it. The tabloids would never speculate openly. But inside the walls of the palace, everyone knew one undeniable truth. Camilla had been bypassed. Completely. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't symbolic. It was explicit. And that sent shockwaves through the household that no one outside could feel, but everyone inside could sense. Now, here's the question everyone asks when they hear about this. Why? Why would Princess Alexandra hand Catherine the Queen Mother's private jewels and leave Camilla, Queen Consort, sitting beside the king, completely out of the equation? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Catherine is the future. Camilla is the present. But anyone inside the royal inner circle will tell you it's never that simple. Because this decision was never about titles. It was never about rank. It was about alignment. Princess Alexandra, and by extension, the Queen Mother, knew something that the public often misses. Not all women beside the monarch are equal. Some are there to symbolize stability. Some are there to test it. And in the Queen Mother's eyes, Camilla represented change. Subtle, persistent, necessary for modernity, perhaps. But not the kind of enduring stability the monarchy had survived on for centuries. Now pause and think about that. This wasn't public snubbing. It wasn't personal animosity. It was calculated. Even the staff who worked with Camilla closely admitted they felt an unspoken shift in the atmosphere when the handover occurred. One aide said quietly, "The room felt different the moment Alexandra walked in. Not because of the jewels, but because of the choice." Choice. That word carries enormous weight inside the palace. Because the Queen Mother and Princess Alexandra knew the power of symbols better than anyone. They understood that a gift, or the withholding of a gift, could speak louder than any statement. And that is exactly what happened here. Bypassing Camilla wasn't a mistake. It was a message. It whispered in the corridors. This is about the monarchy's future, not the present, not appearances, not comfort. Catherine was being positioned, not just as a daughter-in-law, not just as the Princess of Wales, but as someone entrusted with the legacy of the monarchy itself. Now, let's explore another angle. Camilla entered the monarchy under a cloud of controversy. Her relationship with Charles was scrutinized, dissected, and judged for decades. Even as she gained acceptance, there remained a layer of tension. Some senior royals never fully embraced her. Some trusted her, but cautiously. Some never did. And that matters because royal jewels are never merely ornamental. They are symbols of trust, approval, endorsement. So when Alexandra bypassed Camilla, she wasn't insulting her. She was signaling where trust lay, where legacy lay, and who had earned it. Here's where it gets even more compelling. According to palace insiders, there was a private discussion months earlier. Not with Charles, not with Camilla, but with Alexandra. A discussion about the timing of the handover. Catherine's discretion, Catherine's judgment, Catherine's ability to carry the responsibility. And the decision was unanimous. Catherine was ready. Camilla was not the intended recipient. Some observers might call this nepotism. Others might call it favoritism. But in royal terms, it's something far more strategic. It's continuity. It's choosing who is most aligned with the institution's long-term survival. And this is exactly what makes this story so tense. Because the public sees only the titles. They see the crowns, the tiaras, the ceremony. They don't see the decisions made quietly, behind closed doors, that shape the monarchy's future. And the more we dig into this, the more it becomes clear. The handover wasn't a gift. It was a directive, a silent instruction for Catherine, and a silent warning for Camilla. Because while Camilla holds the title of Queen Consort, that title alone doesn't guarantee trust, influence, or alignment with legacy. It only guarantees visibility. And visibility, in the royal family, is not the same as authority. The Queen Mother and Princess Alexandra understood that better than anyone. They knew that history doesn't reward appearances. It rewards consistency, loyalty, endurance. And Catherine, carefully, deliberately, silently, had demonstrated all three. Camilla had not. Or, at least, not in the ways that mattered to Alexandra. Which is why the handover wasn't just a gesture. It was a decision that disrupted the expected order. And disruption, inside a palace that thrives on protocol, is always noticed. Now here's the clincher. This wasn't a one-time oversight. It was a deliberate, strategic bypass. A calculated move to signal whose loyalty aligned with the Queen Mother's vision. And inside that room, the tension was palpable. Because both women understood what was happening. One was giving, one was receiving, and one had been deliberately excluded. That dynamic alone would have been explosive. But what happened next amplified it beyond anyone's expectations. Because the act of bypassing Camilla wasn't silent for long. Someone noticed. Someone who didn't need to. And once that ripple began, the palace could no longer contain it. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It happened behind a closed door. No cameras. No staff. No one outside the palace could have guessed. And that was the point. Because some moments in royal history are never meant to be witnessed. Some decisions are made not for the public, but for the institution itself. Ask yourself this. How often does a senior royal hold a meeting so quiet, so deliberate, that the world remains completely unaware? Rarely. Almost never. But this wasn't just any meeting. Princess Alexandra had arrived at the palace carrying the Queen Mother's private jewels. A box that held decades of memory, trust, and legacy. And she wasn't there to make a speech. She wasn't there to lecture. She wasn't there to explain. She was there to transfer authority. The meeting was short but intense. A few minutes that would change the course of the monarchy for years to come. Imagine the scene. A room lined with portraits of past monarchs. Velvet curtains drawn. A single table in the center. The box resting on it like a crown waiting to be claimed. And there were two women. Princess Alexandra. Catherine. Silence hung between them. Not awkward, but charged. Every eye would have felt the weight of history. Even if no one else was present. Alexandra didn't need to speak to convey importance. Her posture, her gaze, the deliberate calm of her movements, each spoke volumes. And Catherine knew immediately. This wasn't a simple gift exchange. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't sentimental. It was a handover of responsibility. And in that room, time seemed to stretch. Catherine's hands hovered over the box. She didn't touch it at first. She understood instinctively that opening it was a declaration. A declaration that she was ready. A declaration that she accepted the weight of the legacy. A declaration that she understood the Queen Mother's silent instruction. Alexandra finally spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for Catherine to hear. Her words weren't recorded. They weren't meant to be. But the message was clear. This is yours. Protect it. Honor it. Do not fail. Catherine nodded subtly. She didn't need to speak, because some instructions are too profound for words. And then, Alexandra did something unexpected. She didn't leave immediately. She stayed, watching, ensuring the message had been received. It was a gesture that carried as much weight as the jewels themselves. Because in the royal family, observation is as important as action, and the observant eye often carries more influence than the loudest voice. During that short time, Catherine began to understand something critical. The box didn't just contain jewels. It contained stories, secrets, promises. Promises made decades earlier by a woman who had lived through war, scandal, and transition. Promises that could shape decisions in ways the public would never know. And then came the most shocking part of the meeting. Inside the box, Catherine found a letter, not addressed to her, not signed in the way one might expect, but unmistakably intended for her eyes. Its words were concise, yet profound, a reminder of loyalty, a warning about discretion, a challenge about legacy. And when Catherine read the first line, she realized the depth of the Queen Mother's foresight. This was more than a gift. It was a test, because the Queen Mother had known that one day, someone would inherit not just the jewels, but the responsibility to carry forward her vision. And now, Catherine had that responsibility. A weight heavier than any crown, and heavier than most in the palace could imagine. Even as Catherine absorbed this reality, the room remained silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Time itself seemed to pause. And then, in the quiet, Alexandra said something so subtle, so perfectly measured, that it could have gone unnoticed by anyone but Catherine. This is about more than jewels. And in that moment, Catherine understood. She wasn't just holding history. She was holding power, legacy, trust that had been cultivated over decades. And as Alexandra finally stepped back, leaving the room, the gravity of what had just occurred pressed down on Catherine, because she realized something even more chilling. This meeting had been entirely private, and yet, it would ripple through the palace in ways no one could control. The quiet had consequences. The handover had consequences. The exclusion of others had consequences. And Catherine understood one thing clearly. Whatever happened next was now her responsibility, and she couldn't let the legacy falter. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. As Alexandra's footsteps faded down the corridor, Catherine remained seated, staring at the box. The jewels gleamed softly under the palace lighting, but it wasn't the sparkle that held her attention. It was the weight, not physical weight, but the emotional, symbolic, and historical weight pressing down on her. For a moment, she felt the presence of the Queen Mother herself. Not literally, of course, but through intention, through legacy, through decades of silent planning, observation, and guidance. Catherine realized that this moment wasn't about her. It was about something far bigger, the preservation of a monarchy in flux, a vision carefully nurtured, and a trust that had been silently passed down for decades. And yet, Catherine also understood the danger. Power, even the quiet kind, comes with scrutiny, especially in a household where every action is dissected, every choice analyzed, and every gesture interpreted. By accepting the Queen Mother's jewels, Catherine was stepping into a role that demanded perfection. She was inheriting not just history, but expectation. And there was one unspoken truth in the room that hit her hardest. This inheritance was not a reward. It was a challenge, a test of character, a measure of whether she could honor the intentions of a woman who had navigated decades of crises and scandal, never faltering, never yielding. And the irony wasn't lost on Catherine. She had grown up outside the monarchy. She had been married into a family steeped in centuries of tradition. And now, in this quiet room, she was being handed not just jewels, but the trust of one of the most formidable figures the monarchy had ever known. Her mind raced with questions. Could she live up to this trust? Would she be able to carry it forward without misstep? What if history judged her harshly for failing to interpret the message correctly? And then, a final realization struck her. This moment was already public in subtle ways. Not through headlines, not through photographs, not even through rumor, but through observation. The palace staff, the aides, the extended family, they would notice shifts, silences, gestures, access to private rooms. Small signals that insiders would decode immediately. And as Catherine finally lifted the lid of the box, she was struck by the quiet brilliance of the selection. Every piece seemed to tell a story. A brooch from wartime, a pendant from a private family event, a ring worn for personal reflection. And the thought came to her in a chilling flash. This wasn't just about history. This was about responsibility, legacy, and the expectation that she would uphold the principles the Queen Mother had lived by, and Alexandra had carried forward in her stead. For several long minutes, Catherine examined each piece, absorbing not just its beauty, but its significance. And in that silence, she understood the stakes. The monarchy wasn't just a public institution. It was a living entity, held together by trust, tradition, and carefully maintained loyalty. And now, she was a guardian, not a participant, not a figurehead, a guardian. And the realization brought both awe and fear. Because if anyone misinterpreted this transfer, if the wrong signals were sent, it could unravel years of subtle planning. And even though the meeting had ended, even though Alexandra had left, Catherine knew the consequences of this handover would ripple for months, years, and decades to come. She also knew one final, terrifying truth. Nothing in this room would remain secret forever. Because in the royal family, even the quietest actions eventually make themselves known. And once they do, they can't be undone. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It wasn't the jewels that would leave Catherine reeling. It was the note, a single piece of folded paper, tucked neatly beneath the velvet lining of the box. No one outside that room could have imagined its significance. No cameras, no aides, no public statement, just a letter. And in royal terms, letters like this are not casual correspondence. They are instructions. They are legacies. They are messages that outlast lifetimes. Catherine unfolded it carefully, aware that the words inside were deliberately chosen. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, yet precise. Familiar to anyone who had ever seen the Queen Mother write in private. Flowing, controlled, imbued with intention. From the first line, Catherine realized this was no ordinary note. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't formal. It was urgent. The Queen Mother had written it decades earlier. For someone who would one day inherit not just her jewels, but her vision, her values, and her trust. And the words struck Catherine in a way nothing else in the box could. Because they weren't about adornment. They were about responsibility, about discretion, about judgment. The letter reminded Catherine of her position, not just as Princess of Wales, but as a caretaker of history. It spoke of loyalty, integrity, and the burden of trust. It referenced family traditions she had never known existed. And it hinted at alliances and rivalries that had shaped the monarchy long before she arrived. Catherine's pulse quickened. This wasn't history as she had learned it in books. This was history alive. History demanding action. History expecting her to understand its weight. And then came the line that made her pause. One sentence, simple in appearance, yet explosive in implication. A warning, a challenge, a command, though framed as gentle guidance. Catherine read it over and over. And the more she read, the clearer it became. This was a message to one woman alone. Not the king, not Camilla, not any other member of the royal family. Only Catherine. And that meant the responsibility of interpretation was hers and hers alone. The note referenced past events, decisions, and moments of discretion that only someone within the inner circle could truly understand. It mentioned situations where silence had been more powerful than action. It praised subtlety over spectacle. And it warned against visibility when secrecy was required. Catherine felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Because in that room, in that moment, she realized something critical. The Queen Mother had not just bequeathed jewels. She had bequeathed judgment, the ability to act wisely when the world isn't watching, to carry forward a legacy without recognition, to understand the invisible threads that hold the monarchy together. And the note hinted at a past conflict the public would never know. It suggested that certain members of the royal family were not fully aligned with the Queen Mother's vision. It implied that discretion and the ability to navigate it would determine the stability of the institution. Catherine's mind raced. She had entered the royal family carefully, slowly, and strategically. But this was unlike anything she had anticipated. The jewels were tangible. The letter was intangible. And together, they demanded action that could not be ignored. Catherine had always been aware of public scrutiny. She had always understood appearances, media narratives, and ceremonial expectation.